Hello, welcome to another tutorial from BlenderCookie.com. My name is Tiago Nunes, and in the second part of this series we're going to start talking about composition. Composition deals with the arrangement of the elements in your scene, and by using good composition, you can efficiently lead your viewer's attention to where you want it to go and tell the story that you want to tell. You'll be able to minimize distractions and keep the viewer's eyes on the image, and all in all make your piece more pleasing. So let's get started. Before we jump into how to arrange your elements within the frame, let's actually see what options you have concerning the frame itself, because you're not at all limited to the 16:9 format that is your default format in Blender. Actually, 16:9 is more geared towards animation. It has extra space to the sides, which actually makes it a little bit more imbalanced for still images. So for stills, you probably want to go for something like a 3:2. So for example, if you hit 3 times 500 here versus 2 times 500, you get a 3:2 format. It is more balanced, and it still keeps the sense of direction. If you have things that go from one side or the other, or things that are directional in nature, or in this case horizontal in nature, like a car, it really suits them very well. If you're working with something that is very symmetrical, like Suzanne here actually is, or if you're working with something that you don't really want to show any sense of direction at all, you can go for something a little bit more rare, which is the square format. Using a square format really emphasizes the symmetry in things and really takes away all the sense of direction. So if you're depicting some kind of chaos that you really don't want to lead people to think goes one way or the other, you can use the square format and get some interesting results. Now, this is a very rigid format. It's very formal, very square. So if you want to go for something in between, something not as rigid as a square, but not as directional as a 3:2, you can go for something in between, like the 4:3. So for example, if you hit 2000 here, this is a 4:3 format. Now, these are all horizontal, but of course you can go for vertical framing. And you do that by simply switching things around like this. So this is a 3:2 on a vertical. However, keep in mind that because of the way we see things, vertical formats tend to look more stretched, more imbalanced than their horizontal counterparts. So this 3:2 looks a lot more stretched than the 3:2 that we had on the horizontal. So if you're doing verticals, you may or may not, depending on what you're going for, go for something a little bit more balanced like the 4:3. This is how a 4:3 looks on the vertical, and it looks a little bit more balanced. And of course, verticals favor things that are vertical in nature, like, for example, people. Okay, let me bring this back to the 3:2. And now let's talk about filling the frame. Keep in mind that one of our goals with good composition is to minimize the distractions. Filling the frame does not mean cluttering the frame, so don't feel a need to fill every space in your image with stuff. What filling the frame means is how big or small you will make your subject be in proportion to the frame of the image. An image most usually boils down to the subject and its supporting environment, so you just have a decision to make on how to fill the frame with your subject. Do you want Suzanne here, for example, to fill the frame like that? Or do you want her to be just one spot surrounded by the environment? This completely depends on the story that you want to tell. Does the environment have relevance to what is going on? Or does, for example, the expression on Suzanne here tell the whole story? Is the subject very interesting in and of itself? Is it very detailed, for example? Or is it more the environment that surrounds it that is special somehow? Maybe even an unusual environment for that particular subject. Do you want your subject to feel grand and powerful, or do you want him to feel lost, like Suzanne looks lost here in space? That is really all there is to it. You want to fill the frame with more of what you want to show, and less of what is irrelevant. So now that you've decided on how to fill the frame, let's say in this case that you wanted Suzanne here to be this big on the frame, so you show a little bit of the environment. Now it's time to position your subject within the frame. Now, I'll be saying positioning your subject for the sake of simplicity, but what I really mean is positioning your main point of interest. If your subject is a character, for example, and you decided to completely fill the frame with it, you'll have to choose what is your main point of interest on your subject. In portraits, for example, it's usually the eyes, and then work on its best or optimal position. So, have you ever gone on vacation and asked random people to take pictures of you? And sometimes you'll come across people who decide to put you on a bit to the side of the image, unlike most of the people who put you right in the center. And somehow those asymmetrical images turn out to be much more appealing. As a matter of fact, it's the proportions that such asymmetries generate that make an image more harmonious. Now, throughout history, people have studied how to place elements inside a canvas in a harmonious way, and you can actually use several harmony guides, so to speak, that Blender has available to you. So you can find them in the camera settings, down here in composition guides. Now you have several to choose from, and we're going to talk about mainly the rule of thirds, or the golden rule, which is pretty much the same. You can actually superimpose them. You're not limited to just one. But basically what you want with these compositional guides is to place your subjects on the intersection points that the guides give you, or on the lines themselves. So you can see that the rule of thirds divides your image in thirds, basically, on every side. So what you want to do is to place your subject either on the intersections, or say, for example, you have the horizon line, you may want to put it on this third line here, or if you have a building that you want to be your focal point, you want to put it on a vertical line, such as this one. Now, okay, so these points and lines are good for placing our subjects on, but on which one should I put Suzanne here, for example? Well, here's a couple of tips. The first one is that we have an inherent sense of gravity. So if you place your subjects on the lower part of an image, let me just rotate her a little bit like that. There we go. For example, like that. If you put her on the lower part of the frame, it instantly makes her feel more stable. We just feel more comfortable with things that are on the ground instead of suspended somehow. This is especially true in vertical compositions, by the way. Now, another tip is to place your subject on either side of the frame according to the direction they're facing, if there is one, of course. For example, Suzanne here, if I turn her to this side, let me make her bigger to make it more clear. There we go. It's somehow more comforting to our eye to have space in front of Suzanne, to give her space in front of her. And what this does, as opposed to this here, is give it balance. You know, it looks a lot more tense when Suzanne is going this way, but you don't really know what she's going into. Now, let me take this opportunity to say that you own your composition. That means to say that to tell your story, you can break every rule that we talk about. For example, if your story is about Suzanne leaving something behind, just go ahead and position her on the other edge of the frame, the edge that she's actually turned to. That will emphasize the idea of exit, you know, this vector here of where she's going away. And it will draw the attention to whatever she's leaving behind her. Say it's a sad Suzanne over here. Or, you know, and that actually makes your eye uncomfortable, which is good in this situation, because that's pretty much the feeling that you want to communicate, that Suzanne is leaving, she's had it, you know. So if that's what you want, make that informed decision and just go unorthodox. Now, one final trick with framing is that you can also frame your image with elements inside the image itself. This is really useful in making sure that the eye stays inside that frame and is not tempted to wander away from it. So I've got a couple of examples, very, very simple examples set up here for you. Let me just turn on this layer. Now, all I've done here is basically built a doorway. Now, if I turn to the rendered view, and let me switch on depth of field to give it a little bit more impact. So let's turn this to f-stop, 2.8. There we go. And enable limits. I'm not sure if I have to with cycles or not. There we go. So what this does, very rudimentarily, if that's even a word in English, is, to give you a frame inside the frame. And of course, this is not limited to a very simple doorway. You could do, like, for example, a forest you could frame it with trees and plants around it. It doesn't have to be this square, as square as the frame itself is. Not at all. What matters is that you are actually framing your object a little bit better, and therefore avoiding the tendency for the eyes to wonder what is outside of the frame. Now, another example could be this one, for example. Let me turn my lights back on. Here you have Suzanne afraid of these other two Suzannes who seem to be confronting her for some reason. Now, this is also telling a story. What's going on? What is she afraid of? Are these going to beat her up, or what's going to happen? But aside from that, it's also framing Suzanne a little bit better. Since these are out of focus as well, our eye goes directly into Suzanne here, right here in the middle. So this is another way, simple way to frame your subject with elements on the image. So we've talked about framing. Now let's talk about principles of design. If you Google principles of design, you will find that there are quite a few actually, and some of them, such as rhythm or unity, can be quite abstract and difficult to explain. I decided to focus on just a couple of very important principles, which are balance and contrast, because I find that their application is very straightforward and can immediately improve the way you think about your scenes. I strongly encourage you to research other principles of design on your own. The resources out there can seem a little bit draggy and be somewhat abstract, like I said, but even if you just get the gist of what they theoretically are about, they might give you some new ideas. So let's talk about balance. Let me just hide all the stuff that I don't need and actually go back to solid view. Okay, balance. Things in your image carry a visual weight. Objects that appear larger, for example, are visually heavier than objects that appear smaller, and brighter objects are visually heavier than darker objects, for example. The way to achieve balance in an image is to arrange the elements so that the imaginary scale remains, well, balanced. So, for example, Suzanne here, she's pretty much in the middle of the scene. So if I imagine a scale here, let me just draw it out with a grease pencil. This is a scale. The scene is balanced right now. This would not tip the scale to either side. Of course, that's pretty easy since we only have one object right in the middle of the frame. So let's put it to the side. Right now the image is unbalanced. This scale would actually tip down here. So the way you achieve balance is by getting something on the other side, duplicating here Suzanne, for example. And this would make the scale not tip to either side because it has the same weight, same visual weight in this case, on both sides. Now this is static balance or symmetrical balance, which is pretty boring. So usually what you want to get is dynamic balance. And the way you achieve that is by using things with different sizes and different impact, so to speak. So if I make this Suzanne smaller, it makes her have less impact, less visual weight. So this would again bring the scale down here. The way you would balance this is exactly the way you would balance it in a physical world with weight. You would bring the smaller object further to the side, to the tip of the scale, and bring the larger object more towards the center, or the fulcrum, as it's called. This would balance the images again. And that's pretty much what you want to do, both vertically and horizontally. That's how you achieve dynamic balance. This image looks balanced now because even though the visual weights of everything in it are different, they're positioned in a way that compensates for that difference. Now, an important thing to notice is that when you don't explicitly balance your scene with different elements, your eye will still look for balance. What that means is that, for example, if you place your subject on one side of the frame and have absolutely nothing else, after your eye registers this subject, it will be drawn to the opposite side of the frame to search for balance, even if that space is empty. You can use this to subtly give more importance to your environment in your piece. For example, if you have Suzanne here looking at the sky, this would give slightly more emphasis to the sky because your eye gets drawn to this empty space than you would have if you simply had Suzanne right in the middle. Another interesting thing is that you can actually go for tension. Tension is really interesting. Even if an image is balanced, there can be tension in it if the elements are leading the eye in opposite directions and therefore outside of the frame. Say, for example, you have this Suzanne here turned to this side, put her right here, and you duplicate her and turn the other Suzanne to the other side. It's pretty clear now that these Suzannes are mad with each other. This one is drawing our eye to this side, this one is drawing our eye to the other side. The image is still balanced, but there's tension in it. It's like two people pulling on each side of the rope. It's balanced, but it is also very tense. Okay, so let me just clear this up before we get into our last part of today. There we go. Okay, so the other important principle of design that I want to talk about is contrast. Our eyes are drawn to contrasting things. Did you ever play those games as a kid called something like Find the Intruder, where they gave you a set of different objects, then you had to tell which didn't belong to the group because it didn't share a particular trait? Those were challenging, only because the intruder would share several other traits in order to confuse you. Now, when an object is clearly contrasting with others around it, it immediately grabs your attention. I mean, I know exactly where you're looking at right now, but if I hide Suzanne, I have no idea at which of these cubes you're looking at. And this is pretty much why camouflage even exists. I mean, hunters, for example, aside from wearing all that camouflage clothing with colors and patterns that are similar to the ones in the woods, they will even paint their rifles with matte finish to eliminate the tiniest reflections, because they know that that little glint of light is enough to grab the attention of their game and scare it away. And contrast comes in many ways, not just in terms of bright and dark, saturated or desaturated, or in focus or out of focus. And it even comes in terms of other senses, for example, hot and cold, or smooth and rough. So by making your focal point the most contrasting part of the image, or by making your subject contrasting in nature with the environment, you are very effectively drawing your viewer's attention to it. On the other hand, if you have elements in your scene that are not supposed to compete with the main focal point, but have quite a bit of contrast of any kind, they will be distracting. For example, here, if I suddenly made this cube, which is not supposed to be special in any way, if I make it bright, very bright, it will start competing for attention precisely because it starts being contrasting with the rest of the environment. And that is not desirable in this case. Now again, distracting may be what you're going for. So if you want to depict total chaos, for example, just go ahead and spread contrast throughout the whole image. Go crazy. Your viewer's eye will not know where to look, which is exactly what you would be going for in that case. So always remember that these rules that I've been talking about are presented in one way that is supposed to be sensible, but you can always break them if you have a good reason to do so. So that's it for this part of today. Go ahead and do some research to explore these topics even further. There's a lot of information out there. Better yet, take some of your old projects and see if these images could be improved by implementing what we've talked about, or even if you are already implementing these ideas subconsciously. In the next part, we will talk about compositional elements like points, lines, and shapes, and the importance of light and color to further improve your composition. So stay tuned, and I'll see you soon.